How are women and women's stories represented in The Last of Us? How does that representation change from the video game's source material to the HBO adaptation? And why are these changes important?
People are counting on you, you get that? What we do matters.
In this 2-episode miniseries, I'm going to answer these questions with a particular focus on The Last of Us Part 2 video game and the second season of the HBO show. From the changing of Abby's physique, the subtle and not so subtle changes in writing relating to Ellie and other characters, to the techniques used to film and portray certain scenes, I will provide a detailed account of why I think Season 2 of HBO's The Last of Us has some clear problems relating to the portrayal of female characters. These problems affect the quality and richness of the story and its themes, as well as contributing to very real-world negative impacts of female body image, the representation of women in media, and the role of women in society. I hope that these videos spark some very much needed discussion. Here we go. Before we get into episode 1, I just want to highlight a few important points. 1. You may have worked out that yes, I am a man, and I do not pretend to be some sort of expert on the representation of women in media, and I certainly don't have any lived experience of being one myself. What I do have is a deep love and appreciation for The Last of Us video games, particularly Part 2, and could not help but notice that Season 2 of the show has got a lot of problems. And a critical problem, but not the only one, relates to how the women in the show are written and represented. 2. I am in no way attacking or intending to attack the actors who portray the characters I talk about in these videos. The critiques I have relate to other creative decisions and not the capabilities or personalities of the actors involved, for whom I have a great deal of respect. I am aware of the toxic commentary and in no way wish to contribute to that. 3. I've structured this video so that people who have only watched the show can watch at least parts of it without being spoiled. The first part of the video should be fine, with only tiny inconsequential references to things that may or may not happen in Season 3. However, later in the video, there will be heavy spoilers for both The Last of Us Part 2 game and all of the TV show that it's based on, so Season 3 and possibly Season 4 if they end up doing that. Don't worry, I will clearly indicate both visually and with audio where spoilers are about to occur. Okay, back to the video. Let me start with this question. Does Abby's body in The Last of Us matter? In this first video, I'll be discussing why changing Abby's physicality for the show negatively affects a range of character, narrative and thematic aspects of this story, aspects which made the game so rich and powerful. In the second video, I will discuss, you could argue, the even more important issue of how this change relates to the representation of women, the harmful real-world impacts that this change contributes to, and, importantly, that this change is not in isolation, and that Abby's physicality is just one change in a range of changes made for the show which reduce the richness, power and agency of women in the show, and which ultimately hurts the story in a variety of ways, as well as the wider society that is consuming it. For me, The Last of Us Part 2 was the greatest video game I've ever played. In fact, I'll actually go further and say that personally, it is the single most impactful piece of media, of art, that I have ever had the privilege of experiencing, and the character of Abby is central to its excellence. Crucially, her physique was central to her, and this fact seems to have been at best undervalued and at worst dismissed by the show creators and those with power involved in making the show. The showrunners Craig Mazin and Neil Druckmann, who also wrote and directed the games and co-wrote Part 2 with Hallie Gross, have gone on record in interviews saying that Abby's muscularity in the game was partly to differentiate her gameplay style from Ellie's, emphasising varied combat mechanics. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, for example, Druckmann said, "In the game, you have to play both characters, Ellie and Abby, and we need them to play differently. We need Ellie to feel smaller and kind of manoeuvre around, and Abby was meant to play more like Joel in that she's almost like a brute in the way she can physically manhandle certain things. That doesn't play as big of a role in this version of the story because there's not as much violent action moment to moment. It's more about the drama. I'm not saying there's no action here, it's just, again, different priorities and how you approach it." Showrunner Craig Mazin has also said, "I personally think that there is an amazing opportunity here to delve into someone who is perhaps physically more vulnerable than Abby in the game, but whose spirit is stronger. And then the question is, where does her formidable nature come from and how does it manifest? That's something that will be explored now and later." He's also said, "To me, the key was to capture the essence of Abby's spirit, rather than her exact physicality." So we can see from these interviews that Mazin and Druckmann have got clear rationales for why Abby is not muscular in the TV show. And for many people who have watched the show, and even maybe for some who have also played the game, the changes to Abby are justified and have paid off. The substance of her character has been captured. Job done. Well, not for me. The key reason given for why Abby isn't muscular in the HBO adaptation is that in the game, her build was at least in part a gameplay decision, designed to differentiate her playstyle from Ellie's. Now, I do think that is partly true. And as a design choice, it worked brilliantly. For a player of the game, compared to Ellie, Abby feels much heavier, more forceful, and just generally a much more powerful physical presence. It's great. And I also think it's really possible that this choice may have even been the initial reason for making her so strong. But for me, and I think many others, including I suspect Gross and Druckmann themselves, it means so much more than just gameplay mechanical variation. Altering Abby's physicality strips away a layer from what makes her such a unique and impactful fictional character. And I think it does a real disservice to how narratively and symbolically integrated her physique was in the story and themes of the source material. In the game, in the 4 or so years between the events of The Last of Us and its sequel, Abby becomes someone capable of killing Joel. She's obsessed and has a singular focus on this goal. Joel killed her father. And she channels her grief, her pain, and her rage into this one mission. Physical, violent revenge, and she prepares accordingly. She doesn't just become skilled with weapons and learn strategy. I think she definitely does those things, but she also transforms herself physically into someone who could plausibly take on and physically overpower Joel, who, in her understanding, is a monster who slaughtered a multitude of trained soldiers single-handedly and without remorse. She turns herself into a lethal tool built for physical violence. And of thematic importance, someone capable of out-monstering the monster. Even in the show, we see Abby in the opening scene of Season 2, Episode 1, saying that she wants to torture Joel to death.
When we kill him, we kill him slowly.
So in her mind, Abby both needs and wants to become a monster. Needs because she believes she must have a monstrous strength to defeat him. Wants because she wants him to suffer terribly. In the game, she has channeled her pain and anguish through this lens of vengeance and retribution to create this monster and embedded it into the literal fibres of her body. And in the game, we are made aware of this inseparable link between her physical preparation and her obsession with retribution. In this first clip, a flashback from a younger Abby's perspective, sometime after her father's murder at the hands of Joel, we see her drive to prepare.
All right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to get your ass over here, sit on the edge, or you can go down here on the kid seat and look at this view with me.
We can't miss training.
Really? Not even just for one night?
No.
Can we talk about it?
It's getting late.
Yeah.
This training they mention is likely the standard military training the WLF would put all its members through. Now, they may well have this scene in the show, but even this would have less meaning, as surely this training, military training, would involve extensive physical exercise, and unfortunately, Abby's physique in the show really does not reflect years of such training. Let's come back to this point in a moment. In the clip you can clearly see she never misses a day of training. Later, in the same flashback, Abby lightheartedly mentions her strength training to Owen.
Here.
Okay. Holy shit. Look at you.
Pushed 185 pounds yesterday.
Yeah, right.
But then even later in that same flashback, we see this light-hearted facade fade and her drive and focus on revenge is made clear.
I know all the leads have dried up, but Joel's still out there, you know?
I know. What can I do?
Let's go back. We can still make training.
You go ahead.
What about you?
I'm gonna hang out with the SEALs for a little while.
I'm sorry.
I told you already. Don't be sorry.
We're shown here that Abby is determined, not just to never miss training, but that she is putting the hours in to transform her body for her cause, years before we meet her in Jackson. In the HBO adaptation, what Druckmann and Mazin have done is play into this sort of false separation of mind and body, where we are supposed to believe that show Abby is as driven and as set on brutal revenge and physical violence as game Abby, but that this has, in no perceivable way, influenced the physical preparation of someone who is a member of a highly resourced military organisation. This is ultimately, in the context of characters' psychology and the story, less impactful and less realistic than the Abby we get in the game. Because if someone is that consumed by this singular mission and thoughts of violent physical retribution against a physically superior target, they would optimise their chances of success in every way they could think of. Like I said, not just by learning strategy and skills, but by physically building oneself for the task at hand. To be a monster killer. What Druckmann and Gross understood when writing the game is this: psychology drives behaviour. Mind affects body. More generally, in a world like this one, strength is a crucial survival trait, and the ability to physically overpower and dominate people is an asset. An asset, incidentally, which Isaac, the leader of the WLF, takes full advantage of. In the game, Abby is essentially Isaac's right hand. She is of notable status in the WLF. She leads missions, fights on the front lines, and is respected by her peers as a highly capable soldier. In the show, we hear that Isaac was even planning on making her the leader in the event of his death. We also hear that she is seen as a great soldier. But for me, the changing of Abby's physique does really lessen the believability of her standing in the WLF in the show. And I think that's for two main reasons. Firstly, purely in terms of practicality, a soldier, male or female, will need to function at a certain baseline level of physical strength and athleticism. This is true of the real world, and would certainly be true in the world of the WLF, who are in constant war with the Seraphites and at constant risk of attack from them and the infected. Perhaps in the show she will be a great strategist and is the brains, as it were. If so, I think this would be disappointing, as the physical action she's involved in the game is excellent. But also, Again, I find it very hard to believe that the rank and file of a military organisation would take seriously someone who doesn't get their hands dirty and just sits behind a desk, especially, and this brings me on to my second point, especially when that person is a small, young woman. What can we say about military organisations? In this case, the American military in the real world. Well, they are fundamentally patriarchal institutions. Sexism is very much baked in. Yes, there are female soldiers and female officers, but they are few and the majority are junior officers, and you will certainly not see any high-ranking young women. In the context of The Last of Us, perhaps you could say that given the decimation of society, women in the military were needed in greater numbers, and I think that's very reasonable to say. However, as Mazin says himself in the HBO podcast for Season 2, Episode 1, society ended in 2003. But that doesn't mean attitudes did.
Seth had a moment in the game that was important. And in our world, which stopped at 2003 in terms of its social progress and development, there was simply not the acceptance of gay people or lesbian people or anybody on that flag. And Seth comes from that world, clearly. We'll find out who he was and where he came from. But it was important to not pretend that the people in this world would necessarily be in a 2024 mindset about, say, queer people.
I totally agree with Mazin here. When looking at the American military, from 1994 to 2011, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was in place, which prevented gay or lesbian soldiers from revealing their sexuality. We can also see from many reports and research that sexism and the consequences for women that come with that is an ongoing issue in the military. It's a real problem. So, when you make a point of having an obviously bigoted character such as Seth hold on to his values from the old society from which they were generated, in a civilian-centric society like Jackson, which even has an active therapist, but in the same breath imply that similar bigoted values and prejudices do not exist in a military organisation that has entrenched values such as these, it really does not make sense. You can even make the argument that Abby in the game would realistically face, or maybe has faced, prejudice from members of the WLF, but has overcome such barriers through proving herself in the field as a physically capable soldier. I do not think it's very believable that Abby in the show would hold such status in the WLF. Even if the writers next season manage to write a compelling narrative regarding her position in the WLF, I cannot see why, in terms of the overall story and Abby's character, they would change her physique in this way. It by no means is better or lives up to her portrayal in the game. In short, Abby being physically strong is not just an added thrill for gameplay. It's not even just realistic, it's necessary. It's necessary because of the world she lives in, combined with the position of prominence she has in a highly resourced military organisation. But most importantly, it's necessary given the personal background and narrative for the character. It's necessary if you want the character to be as deep and as complex and as impactful and symbolic as possible. There are multiple scenes and moments in the game where Abby's physique plays an important part in increasing the drama and tension of that scene. And ultimately, in some way, the cinematic impact that her physique has relates back to the points I've just made regarding her character background and thematic richness. Let's take a look at the Joel death scene.
Y'all act like you heard of us or something.
Because they have.
Just to be clear here, I'm only talking about how Abby's physique impacts the scene. I do have some other issues with how this scene was represented in the TV show, but I'm not getting into that here. Let me know if you want a video covering this. I'm purely focusing on Abby's physique here. Now, I can totally appreciate that for many who have not played the game, and I imagine at least some who had, this scene in the show was still an impactful emotional scene. But for me, without her imposing physical presence, it just felt less impactful than the game. By no means bad, just not as good. In the game, you can look back at Abby in this scene and appreciate the innate connection between the body Abby has built through her rage and her pain and her fixation on vengeance. You can visually see, without the need for expository dialogue, the years of obsessive dedication that has gone into this moment. In the show, this visualization of character psychology, of the physical culmination of years of obsessive thought, it's simply not there. And so that scene becomes just that little less deep, that little less layered. Again, that doesn't mean it's bad, just not as good. And lastly on the Joel death scene, there's the issue of audience suspension of disbelief. Joel has very decisively been established as a man who is a physical tool of destruction, who navigates the world through overwhelming brute force. Having Abby as a petite, small person and having her physically beat Joel to death, does that perhaps endanger the instinctive feeling of believability of this scene for the audience? I say instinctive because, yes, it is believable, or at the very least possible in logical terms, for someone of Abby's size in the show to kill a man with a metal golf club. Logically it is. But in the moment, during the scene, where the audience needs to be immersed in what is happening, is there a part of people's experience that gets jarred here? How can this small person kill Joel? Well, I suppose it is possible. As a writer or showrunner, you don't want people to question in any way the plausibility of the scene as it's happening, particularly one so impactful and pivotal. Now, maybe some of you are rolling your eyes and saying, no, it was very impactful, I disagree. But think about this. Wouldn't it have been even more imposing and dread-inducing if Abby was built like an ox, towering over Joel? Before Joel's death in the game, we have a short bit of gameplay as Abby where she takes down some infected with her bare hands, which briefly showcases her strength and capability for extreme violent force. So, in addition to just her physical appearance in the Joel death scene, we have already seen that she is easily a physical match for Joel, even without the shotgun shell to the knee. So there is not that same risk of the audience suspending their disbelief. Quite the opposite. For me anyway, it was just, oh my god, this monster's got Joel. Look at the size of her. We've seen what she's capable of. He's in trouble. Okay, this is where show-only people might want to stop, as it's about to get mega spoilery for season 3 onwards. So come back in a few years or play the game and come back. You have been warned. Okay, let's talk briefly about the fights in the theatre. The physical confrontation between Abby and Ellie in the theatre is tense and fear-inducing, and Abby's physique is a key ingredient which ups the ante. Could the show produce a tense scene where these two characters of similar size hunt each other down? Of course. But I do not think it can replicate the same fear you have for Ellie, knowing that if Abby gets her hands on Ellie, Ellie, for lack of a better word, is fucked. As I write this script, it was literally yesterday that I replayed this part of the game with my wife, and it is horrific, in a good way. The game developers did a pretty good job of trying to balance the encounter by having Ellie be the one who is armed and Abby with nothing. But honestly, even the first time I played this, it felt like Abby was the hunter. All she needed to do was to get hold of Ellie. In this scene, it really is the physical power of Abby that is the primary source of tension and fear. It's this power which really sets it apart from other tense scenes where there's guns and blades. And what makes it even more tense is that we know the physical power and violence Abby is capable of. In the game, we have plenty of gameplay with Abby that enforces this, but what is really at the emotional core of this scene is that we have seen what she did to Joel with that strength, and now she's going to do that to Ellie. It's brutal poetry. The show will have none of this. I think this scene in the show could still be good, but as I've said before, just not as good. I'll leave it at these examples in terms of specific scenes. There may be others coming up in the next season where this point also applies, but I will just reiterate that there are multiple points in the game where Abby's strength heightens the tension and drama. The relationship between Abby and Lev and Yara, particularly between Abby and Lev, is, at least in the game, a transformative feature of Abby's story. Driven by her trauma and the psychological repercussions of her brutal murder of Joel, Abby seemingly transforms over the course of her storyline from an apparent murderous, hate-filled monster fueled by pain and rage, who is prepared to sacrifice relationships with her friends and those closest to her, to a protector, powered by empathy and love, who risks her life to save those who she saw as enemies. Now, there is no reason that in the next season of the show, Caitlin Dever's Abby can't go through this same psychological transformation, and with the right script and direction, this can still be a compelling piece of storytelling. But, as with all of my points so far, it will be missing that extra layer of depth and meaning because the show's Abby does not have the physique. Let's hear again from Neil Druckmann being interviewed in Grounded 2, which is a documentary about making The Last of Us Part 2.
I don't remember at what point we decided to go with someone like really kind of muscular and broad, but I remember once the idea came up, it felt very fresh. And there's something interesting in Abby feeling a lot like Joel.
Yeah, this is very interesting. And that's not just because of mechanical gameplay similarities. The parallels between Joel and Abby, and the relationships of Joel and Ellie, and Abby and Lev, are impactful and important. With or without the gameplay aspect, what really struck me when playing the game were these clear parallels between the role Joel played in the first game and the role that Abby ended up playing in the second game. That of the loving protector of a young person who is desperately in need of one. And whilst the reasons for them taking on these protector roles are different, the similarity is there. And part of that similarity and the parallels that can be drawn is their physicality. Having Abby be much more physically vulnerable in the show, I feel, again, waters down and reduces the power of such a parallel. Of course, this parallel can still remain in the series, but we should not dismiss that TV is a visual medium and that visual imagery is powerful. A great example of such powerful and parallel imagery is when Abby in the game carries Yara to safety after she has been brutally injured by the Seraphites. This harkens back to the image of Joel at the start of the first game carrying the injured Sarah to safety, or so he hoped. And then again at the end of the first game when he repeats this as he carries the unconscious Ellie away from the Fireflies. Perhaps an even more salient parallel is when Abby carries the unconscious Lev to the boat at the end of the game. Now, of course, at this point, Abby has lost a great deal of her strength due to the torture and starvation she has suffered, but she is still substantially bigger than Lev and is physically able to carry him to safety. And she has already been established as his big protector, so the parallel remains. Two bigger, stronger protectors physically carrying their young loved ones to safety. I think something else important to consider is this. The visual image of a strong protector saving a weak, vulnerable person is powerful in and of itself, but it is more powerful and layered when considering that we as players, up until Abby saving Yara, had only seen Abby's physicality be put to monstrous use. She had used her great strength for pain and suffering and vengeance and punishment. Now, at this point in the game with the introduction of Lev and Yara, we see for the first time Abby using the very tool that she had created for destruction, for protection. What had been the physical manifestation of her pain and grief and rage was now being used for healing. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, that is pretty powerful. Powerful visual imagery. Finally, on this point of parallels in Joel and Abby's relationships, I really just want to touch on something that isn't strictly to do with Abby's physique. Have you ever noticed this? I love this so much. More than once in the game, we hear about Ellie's love of canvas sneakers, or trainers if you're British. Seeing the exact same type of Converse trainer that Ellie had at the start of the game when Joel comes into her room, being worn by Lev at the end of the game when he's with Abby, is such an incredible touch, which I think tells us subtly, but very clearly, that the creators of the game intended these parallels between the relationships of Joel and Ellie and Abby and Lev. But it doesn't really matter if the intention was there or not. To me, what really is important is that the parallels are there, and Abby's physique and the repetition of the Converse trainers are complementary ingredients that enrich and reinforce these parallels. At the end of the game, Ellie finally tracks down Abby and finds her tied to a post on the beach in Santa Barbara. She is starved, thin, weak, defeated. a shadow of her former self. Now, again, the show can go some way to represent this. With good acting, lighting, cinematography, you can portray a weakened Abby, sure. But because of show Abby's petite physical form, it will never be able to capture that same impactful, stark and shocking physical waste that Abby has in the game. That terrible contrast between Abby before and Abby now. Added to this, if the show resembles the game in this scene, we're going to be seeing Abby like this from Ellie's perspective. The 2 times Ellie has seen Abby is when she was at full strength, killing Joel and Jesse, severely wounding Tommy, and easily physically overpowering Dina and Ellie herself in the theatre. So Ellie has this clear perception of Abby as this hulking monster with bestial strength, and then she is confronted with this shriveled, helpless prisoner. And briefly, I don't know about you, but in the game she was so unrecognisable that when I was looking for her on the beach, I walked straight past her several times. Eventually I saw her and my wife and I literally gasped. Again, that visual image was powerful. And for Ellie, this extreme contrast, I think, is crucial for how she reacts in the following few minutes. Because of the sudden extreme contradiction that Ellie is faced with in terms of how she perceives Abby, it creates a tumultuous battle in her mind between the murderous physical beast she holds in her memory and the weak, defeated, tortured shadow she sees in front of her. Just as with the audience reaction, this moment should have a powerful impact on Ellie. But I think the most powerful thing about this visualization of Abby at the end of the game is what this represents. You could interpret it as something like revenge and destruction will ultimately lay waste to the individual that dedicates themselves to that end. And that definitely matches with the themes of the game and the road that Ellie goes down as well. There's definitely something to that. You could also interpret it as the armour and weapon, the monster she built around her being, her physique, has been stripped away, leaving her vulnerable self, her humanity, exposed. Again, there's something to this interpretation, but for me, neither of these interpretations are completely right. Now, I don't know what exactly Druckmann and Gross intended to portray in this moment thematically, but for me, what is so powerful and so unbearably tragic about the moment that we, through Ellie, see Abby's emaciated form tied up on the beach is that her humanity has been taken from her. In other words, her muscles, her strength, were the manifestation and literal embodiment of her humanity in all its beautiful and horrendous complexity. Both its capacity to enact pain and suffering, and also its capacity to enact protection, care, and love. This was all so artistically represented by her physique in the game. Rather than her true humanity being exposed, her image on the beach represents an object of defeat, suffering, and pity. One devoid of agency. I also think that it's somewhat of a morally problematic interpretation to say that only when Abby, a woman, is in a physically weak and vulnerable form, only then is her humanity revealed to us. But again, let's put a pin in that and come back to that in the next video when I talk about the representation of women in The Last of Us. Now, before I wrap up this first episode, I just want to talk briefly about Abby's hair. It's not strictly her physique, but I think it is an important physical attribute to note. In the game, Abby has a prominent, long, thick braid, which had many players marvelling at the hair physics. It was an obvious, deliberate, creative choice. Why, I wonder? In the show, she has a braid, but it is, at least to me as a game fan, conspicuously small and unremarkable. At the end of the game, on the beach, her head is shaven. To me, this represents 2 things. 1, that her individuality has been taken from her, and 2, thematically, this has incredibly powerful associations with strength and power. Across various cultures throughout history, long hair has been closely associated with strength, and the cutting of it with weakening and defeat. Possibly the most famous example, and the closest thematically to this scene in the game, is the Judeo-Christian story of Samson. The long hair of Samson in the Bible's Old Testament is the source of his incredible physical strength, and he is only subjugated and imprisoned after Delilah tricks him and cuts his hair, sapping him of that strength. This symbolism, showing Abby with her hair cut, along with her musculature shriveled away, is yet another layer to the powerful imagery and thematic depth of the game. So, Just as it is with Abby's physique, reducing the prominence of her hair in the show ultimately reduces the impact of what follows. And particularly with this point about the hair, the show misses out on mythological and cultural associations entirely, and it's poorer for it. Hopefully I have articulated some important reasons as to why changing Abby's physique and appearance for the show is in fact, unlike what the showrunners have claimed, crucial to the character of Abby and what she represents within the story being told. Something I have seen a fair amount of online from those who love the show, including at least some that have also played the game, is the opinion that both the game and the show are great, and that they are just as good. They are just different. But difference should not just be automatically synonymized with equivalence. Yes, of course, different things can be just as good and equally enjoyable, and there is a great deal of subjectivity in appreciating creative work. For example, I think that The Godfather and The Matrix are equally good films. I have my personal preference, but for me at least, in the case of these films, they are of the same quality. They're just different. But that's not always the case. I've seen a bunch of student films in my life, including one made by my 15-year-old self, and I can safely say that none of them are as good as The Godfather or The Matrix.
Oh, hi, Mark.
In these cases, difference does not also translate to as good as. And when it comes to creative works such as The Last of Us, and particularly Part 2, which have such rich, meaningful stories and themes woven into their very essence, thoughtful critique of any adaptation of these works is valid and should not be dismissed by such statements as they are just as good, they're just different. No, I reject this, especially when, in the case of The Last of Us, the adaptation is, in broad terms, so close to the source material. If the creators had decided to go a completely different route with the show, with Abby, then yeah, I would have been disappointed, but at least they could have told their own new coherent story, without downgrading the one from the source material. The changes they have made, such as making Abby small and petite, lessened the impact and reduced the believability of the story beats and themes from the game that they are still trying to stick to. There is such a meaningful depth to why Neil Druckmann and Hallie Gross made Abby so physically powerful in the game. It's more than just gameplay mechanics. Abby means so much more to people than this. Her physique is character, it's storytelling, it's layered. And also, as I'll explore in the next episode, it's an important tool for combating the orthodoxy of the representation of women in media. Representation which has real-world effects on physical and mental health and societal attitudes towards women. Gross and Druckmann ultimately created the richness and depth of The Last of Us Part 2 by portraying women with agency and with a realistic complexity rarely seen on screen. This, unfortunately, is not the case with the show. Until the next episode, thanks for listening.
Thank you.